Good morning. Am I on? Can't tell. Can y'all hear me? All right. Let's get started. Good to see everybody this morning. Ooh, here now. Got a lot of people out. Of course, it's summertime. Everybody going vacations and all that sort of good stuff. Let's begin our class with prayer. Father, we thank you so much for the day. Look forward to worshiping you and serving you and giving you praise and honor collectively. And Father, we just ask that you be with us, give us guidance always, give us wisdom. Help us, Father, always be bold in our faith. We love you so much, Father, and look forward to this class and just pray that things will go well. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, let's pick up with Joseph and try to get out of Genesis. You could spend 6 months on Genesis without any problem whatsoever. So we're just sort of hitting the high spots on it. And we'll probably get out of Genesis today, I hope, and get on into the rest of it. But anyway, beginning at Joseph, we got to where Joseph's brothers had sold them into slavery, and he's now been taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar, which is the captain of the bodyguard of the Pharaoh himself. And the interesting thing about what's happened to Joseph, and of course it's God looking after Joseph and taking care of Joseph, but everything Joseph touches turns to gold, so to speak. Everything he does, God blesses him and takes care of him. Look at Genesis chapter 39. This is where he's sold to Potiphar. And beginning in verse 3, it says, "Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. And it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field." So Joseph was well blessed, and he had a pretty comfortable job here. But there's a problem came up. Potiphar's wife noticed how handsome and how good Joseph looked, and she decided she wanted to get him to come to bed with her. And Joseph, the integrity that he has, refused. He said, "How can I do this when your husband is taking care of me and giving me everything I want? I can't do this." And she stayed after him for quite some time, and finally she ended up accusing him of trying to rape her. Potiphar, of course, as you might expect, got mad and threw him into prison. And in prison, in chapter 39, verse 21, it says, after he's thrown into prison, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail, so that whatever was done there he was responsible for. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper." So even in this adverse situation with Joseph being thrown into prison, the Lord still blessed him, and he still recognized who Joseph was. And of course, in prison, he had the chief cupbearer and the baker were thrown in. Pharaoh threw them into prison, and Joseph interpreted their dreams, which led him to getting out of prison, because Pharaoh himself had some dreams. And the cupbearer remembered what Joseph had done for him and mentioned it to the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, "Bring him out. I need somebody to interpret these dreams." So they cleaned Joseph up, shaved him, made him look good, and brought him in front of the Pharaoh, and he interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams. And these dreams that Pharaoh had was in God's providence. If you remember what the dream was, they had 5 fat cows and or 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And the dream was all about there was going to be a lot of abundance, good rain, a lot of good crops, a lot of abundance, and then there was going to be 7 years of famine following that. And Pharaoh recognized who this Joseph was, and he says in verse 39 of chapter 41, it says, "So Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has informed you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are.'" So he basically made Joseph second in command to all of Egypt. He was second only to Pharaoh and all of Egypt. So he prepared for these famines by storing up crops, storing up all that the wheat and everything, so that they had an extreme abundance of that to get them through the famine. And this famine was widespread. It wasn't just in Egypt. It was all over the Middle East area. So Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family that was back in Canaan ran out of food. So Jacob sent the brothers down to Egypt to get food, because he had heard and was told that there's food abundant in Egypt. Now this sets a stage where the brothers have to come in front of Joseph and bow down to Joseph, because he was second in command to Pharaoh, and that's what you would do. You would bow down. You remember the dream Joseph had way back when he was 17 years old? He said, "I had a dream that you're all going to bow before me." This is coming true right here, because they did bow in front of Joseph. Now Joseph, I don't know, it doesn't really say, but he toyed with his brothers. The next several chapters, he toyed with his brothers by saying, "Y'all are spies." And of course they argued, "No, we're not spies. We're just here trying to get some food." And he said, "Well, the only way you can prove you're not spies is I'm going to keep one of you. You go back and get the younger brother Benjamin and bring him in front of me. That'll prove you're not spies." And he toyed with them like that. And of course, he kept Simeon, and the brothers went back, brought food back to Jacob. Jacob was very upset about this, and he said, "No, you're not taking Benjamin down there. If you take him, Joseph has already died and been killed. If you take Benjamin, something happens to him, I couldn't handle it. My heart would quit." So anyway, he refused to do that. They run out of food again. Jacob says, "Go back down there and get some more food." And brother says, "We can't unless we take Benjamin." And Jacob finally had to give in to that, and they brought Benjamin down there. And Joseph continued to toy with his brothers by sending them all back with food, but he put the money back in the bags and put one of their idols in one, or not an idol, but a cup, Joseph's cup, in Benjamin's bag. And he sent them on the way. Well, just shortly thereafter, he sent the army down there and said, "Hey, you stolen something." They said, "No, we didn't. Whoever stole it, maybe they can die. Whoever did that," because it's just simply not the case. And of course, it was in Benjamin's bag. Benjamin had to go back, and Joseph continued to toy with him. Finally, he admits who he is. He says, "Hey, I'm your brother." And of course, they were astounded by that. And they were all made up and cried on each other's shoulders and all that kind of stuff. And he convinced, he said, go back and get our father, bring him down here, because I will take care of him. There's plenty of food, and I will take care of him, get them through the famine. So that's what they did. Jacob ends up being going down to Egypt, and there ended up being 70 that went to Egypt. When you figure Jacob and all of his sons and their wives and the grandsons, a total of 70 people moved down to Egypt. And while they're there, Jacob, which his name has been changed to Israel, if you remember, he ends up dying. He dies in Egypt. He's 147 years old at his death. They embalmed him, which was reserved only for kings and hierarchy, but they embalmed him and sent him back to, or took him back to Canaan. He was buried with I guess in a family plot, as you might call it. Abraham was there, Isaac was there, Rebekah was there, He buried Leah there, and now Jacob ends up being buried there. So they buried all these. In verse 31 of chapter 49, it says, they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. They buried Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and there I buried Leah, and I want to be buried there too. So they took him back and buried him there. And on the way back, the brothers got together and said, hey, Joseph could be being nice to us because our father was still alive, and now that he's dead, there might be some retribution for what we did to him so long ago. So they went to him and said, the last thing our father told us is to forgive us and not hold this against us. And Joseph, in chapter 50, verse 19 and 20 says, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. So this whole situation from the time, actually all the way back to Abraham, God has been putting this together to get the people unified and brought together, because remember he told Abraham, I'm going to make a nation out of you. And there'll be so many people you can't even count them. That'll be your descendants. Well, how's he going to do that with just a handful of people here? Right now, they've only got 70. So they have no infrastructure. They have no nation. It's not possible. So in God's providence, he comes up with this situation, and we'll get into it when we get into Exodus. But he comes up with his game plan of how I'm going to make a nation out of Abraham's descendants. All right, death of Joseph. Joseph dies. He lived about 55 years after his father's death. He's 110 when he died. So he was second in command in Egypt for about 80 years. Now, God had told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he talked to them directly and said, I will make a great nation out of you. He never told Joseph that's in the Bible. He may have told Joseph, but it's not recorded. But Jacob evidently passed this on to Joseph, because one of the last things Joseph said in verse 24 of chapter 50, he said, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you to him from this land to the land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph was well aware of this promise, this covenant that God had made with Abraham. He's well aware of it. And so he tells them that because he says, I want you to take me back. When you go back to Canaan, I want you to take my body and bury it there. Now, at the death of Joseph, this ends the patriarchal age in the Bible. There's really only 3 patriarchs. Joseph was never really a patriarch. You had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as your 3 patriarchs. Because a patriarch was simply somebody who was head of a family that God spoke directly to. And God never really spoke directly to Joseph that we have an account of. But this covenant that was given to Abraham and has been passed on down through this time, this is what this whole storyline is about. Of course, the covenant ultimately brings us Jesus Christ. And this covenant is just simply part of that. Now, covenant, by definition, is to enter into a formal agreement to commit to a particular course of action, which is sanctioned by an oath normally sworn by all parties involved in a solemn ceremony of ratification. Now, I don't know if y'all thought about it or not, but we do covenants all the time. If you buy a house, did y'all not sign some paperwork? That's a covenant. That's a contract. And basically a covenant and a contract is basically the same thing, because it's 2 parties agreeing to do something. And that's basically, you buy a car, you buy a house, whatever you do, that you sign a contract, you've entered into a covenant. So covenants is something that we're we're very familiar with. Of course, this was a special covenant in a couple of ways. First off, it was an everlasting covenant to bring us Jesus Christ. But this covenant, if you'll notice as you read through Genesis, it's not two-sided. Only God. If you remember back, Abraham walked through an old tradition that they had where they split animals in half, and the parties who are entering into the covenant walked through that. Animals on each side, and they walked through that, and it's just a simple way of saying, I promise, and if I don't fulfill this, then what's happened to these animals that's been split in half can happen to me. But only God walked through there. Abraham did not. This covenant was one-sided. Of course, it was planned that way. God said, this is what I want. And he says, all you got to do, Abraham, is live for me. Have faith in me. All you got to do. So, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they never saw this nation, but they had faith that it was going to happen. They walked in faith just as we should and must do. Looking for that city which is foundation, architect, as builder is God. All right. Now this brings us to the end of Genesis. Any thoughts on Genesis before we jump on into Exodus?
Yeah, but Paul, when Joseph told Pharaoh to look out a man that's sweet and white, he didn't ask for the job. He didn't say, point me in. He just said, look out a man that's sweet and white.
And that's right, he didn't. He wasn't promoting himself for the job, but Pharaoh saw that God was with him, and Pharaoh said, ain't nobody better than you because God's with you. So.
He could have said, give me the job since I interpreted your dream. But he didn't say that. He said, look out a man sweet and white.
That's right. That's exactly what happened. All right, Exodus, second chapter of the Bible. Moses wrote this book. And Exodus in Greek means departure or going out. And that's exactly what Exodus was. They departed from Egypt. Exodus basically takes up where Genesis ends, but there is a time lapse of roughly 300 years between the end of Genesis and where Exodus picks up, about 300 years. And you can figure that because Joseph was 30 years old when he became second in command, according to Genesis 41, verse 46. He was 110 when he died, as we have already said in Genesis 50. And that puts Joseph serving for 80 years. Well, the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. So if you take 400 minus 80, so that's 320 years left. So there's a gap. We don't know why. The Bible doesn't say why. The Bible never explains why there's a gap. Same as there's a gap between the Old Testament and New Testament. It's never explained, but there is a gap there of a substantial amount of time. Joseph probably served under 2 pharaohs, possibly 3, during his 80-year serving in Egypt. And when this time frame comes now, the first 7 verses of Exodus is really just kind of an update, a backstory to get us into Exodus. Because all it is now the names of the sons of Israel came to Egypt was Jacob. And he goes through all the names, and the sons of Israel was fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. And that's kind of and that brings us, and very quickly, covers 300 years in just a few verses right there, very quickly. And in verse 8 it says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, this new king was probably from Hyksos kings, and there was a big, if you recall, we talked about Egypt, there was several dynasties over eons of time, and these people, these Hyksos people, Hyksos, they were not really Egyptians. They were foreigners who came in and just basically took over the country. There wasn't a lot of them, and that's the reason it goes on and talks about Let's see, it's in verse 10, come let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war they also might join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. They were very concerned because there were so many Israelites. There was approximately 600,000 fighting men, which is fighting age is between 20 and 50. So there's 600,000 of them, so you got people over 50, people younger 50, you got wives and all that. So a lot of people had come together in a period of 400 years. From 70 to probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million, 2.5 million, possibly some commentaries even say it could be as many as 3 million people. And you say, whoa, wait a minute, that's a lot of people in 400 years. Well, not really. If you stop and think about it, the United States increased from nothing to 100 million people in roughly 400 years. Because when the United States America was founded, was long before the Declaration of Independence in 1776, back in 1400. So you're looking at roughly 400 years, we grew to that size. So that's not something out of reach in any way whatsoever. Now we can pretty much mark on the calendar the actual date of the Exodus. It's 1446 BC, and we know that because if you look at 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, it tells us that the temple was going to be constructed 480 years after. Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt in the 4th month of Solomon's reign that the temple was started. Now when you get to that point in history, time starts getting substantially more accurate. Within a few years anyway, because they've changed the calendar several times over the time frame there. But the 966 BC was when the temple was started. So you back that up 430 years, you get to 1446 BC. So we got a good idea when the Exodus happened. And the story of Exodus actually begins some 80, maybe 100 years prior to the Exodus. You remember Moses was born. He stayed in Egypt 40 years, and then he was exiled for 40 years, and then he came back. So that's 80 years there. So approximately 100 years prior to the Exodus is when Moses, or the beginning of Exodus, starts. Now, it says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And from there, they decide to put him into slavery so that they could control him. And that really wasn't work. They continued to multiply, so they told the midwives, every son that's born, kill him. The midwives didn't cooperate with that. So they made a decree. If you see a Hebrew baby and he's a boy, kill him. So they were trying genocide there to try to reduce this population and try to get it under control because they're growing at such a rate. They were very scared that there were going to be an uprising and they wouldn't be able to control them and handle them. And of course, we know the story there. Moses comes along, chapter 2, the birth of Moses. He was born, his mother and father were both Levites. And he was born, she took care of him for about 3 months, could no longer take care of him because of this decree. They were really cracking down and killing babies. So she puts him in a little boat or whatever you want to call it, and puts him in the Nile and floats him down the river. And none other than the princess of the Pharaoh's daughter, found her. By coincidence, of course. Found her, found him, and took him in and raised him as her own. And so he was educated, and he was everything that Egypt had to offer as far as education and all that had to offer. Moses was able to take advantage of that. If you want a real quick study of the Old Testament, Acts chapter 7 gives you a very nice, compact revealing of the Old Testament. So sometime you want to just kind of read through Acts chapter 7 and see how things all came together. You can get that, and it'll just condensed, very condensed, so you might want to do that at some point. And we'll refer to Acts chapter 7 somewhat too. But Egypt and the Bible, I want to mention this too. Make sure I got all my notes here I want to cover. Egypt and the Bible were almost inseparable. All the way down through time, they were just always working with each other. Egypt was settled by descendants of Ham. Abraham spent time in Egypt, if you remember. Jacob moved his family there. Joseph was a ruler, as we've talked about. Hebrews spent 400 years there. Moses was adopted by the sons of the queen of Egypt. The religion of Egypt was calf worshiping, and we'll see as we go on that the Israelites succumbed to calf worshiping. Many prophecies that we'll see as we go through the Old Testament were about Egypt, concerning Egypt. Jeremiah the prophet died in Egypt. Many fled whenever they had to downfall Jerusalem, and they went into exile. Many of them fled to Egypt. From the captivity of the time of Christ, there was a large population of Israelites in Egypt. The Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, which Jesus quoted from, was put together in Egypt. And if you recall, Jesus spent his childhood, a good deal of his childhood, in Egypt. And Egypt was a very important early center of Christianity. So they really are tied together in history. And Moses was his birth. This was probably, next to Abraham, was the most revered man in Jewish history. There's three prominent figures in Jewish history. Abraham, who's the father of the nation. Moses, who we're going to talk about for a while, was a leader of the nation. And David, the other prominent person in Jewish history, was, of course, the king of the nation. So here we have the leader of the nation. And Moses had quite a task, did he not? Whenever he was raised, his first 40 years, you might say he had it pretty good. He had everything he wanted, everything he dreamed of. But then he was exiled, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And he spent the next 40 years herding sheep. And then the last 40 years of his life, he spent herding people. And these people that he had to herd were, The sheep were much easier, because these people were stiff-necked. They rebelled constantly. They complained constantly. And not only that, but Moses had to build a nation from nothing. These people were enslaved, so everything that happened to them, everything they did was given to them by the Egyptians. They didn't have to worry about anything. They had no infrastructure. They had nothing. And Moses had to take this and mold this into some kind of a nation so that they could move on into history. And he had quite a time with it. Like I said, he's born from the tribe of Levi. His sister was named Miriam. His older brother was Aaron. His father was Amram, and his mother was Jochebed. And when Moses was found by the princess of Egypt, it worked out that Jochebed was able to nurse Moses and bring him on. And of course, that's where he learned about who he was. I'm quite certain that he learned from his mother about his people, because he was a Jew, even though he's raised as an Egyptian. He was a Jew. Now, at 40 years old, Moses went out to visit his people, and he saw one of the taskmasters whipping up on one of the Jews, and he killed him, killed the taskmaster. And he buried him thinking he could get away with it. He went out the next day and he broke up a fight between a couple of Jews, and they said, "Who do you think you are? You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian yesterday." And of course, this scared him to death. So he decided, it's time for me to leave, because the Pharaoh was pretty upset about it too. In verse 15 of chapter 2, it says, "When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." But so he traveled, he left, and met up with the Midianites. You remember who the Midianites are? Descendants of Abraham by Keturah, his second wife. So he met up with them, and he ended up marrying Jethro, which was the high priest of that tribe. He ended up marrying his daughter, and they had two children. And he shepherded sheep for the next 40 years in and around Mount Sinai, in that area right there. Now, it's interesting that Mount Sinai is where he's going to lead them when they go into Exodus. They end up at Mount Sinai. So it's kind of like he was shepherded there. Again, God's providence shepherded him there so that he knew the lay of the land, and he kind of had an idea of where everything was as he brought these people down into that part of the world. As I said, he had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. And during this time, chapter 4, he is God comes to him. Actually, in chapter 3, chapter 3, verse is a burning bush. God comes to him in a burning bush. And this is very important. This section of the Bible right here is very important. It says here that God heard the groaning of the Israelites, and he basically came to Moses and said, "You're the man." Now, did Moses say, "Yeah, let me get back to Egypt. Let me do that for you"? Or what did Moses do? You remember? Huh? Yeah, he started, as we say in Alabama, he started crawfishing because he didn't want the job. He came up with all these excuses. And of course, God said, "No, I'm not going to listen to you. You're the man. I picked you. You're going." So Moses finally agreed to it. And in this section of the Bible right here, it says, verse 5 of chapter 3, it says, Then he said, God said, "Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Now, it's interesting because this is the first time in Scripture that the word holy is used. I found that kind of interesting. And he goes on and says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Verse 7 says, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression from which the Egyptians are oppressing them." So, God is answering the call of the people. Now, the Israelites, God's almost seems like through this course of the 300 years up to the time that we're in right now, it's almost like God is an impersonal God, because there's no record of God talking to his people that we have. There's no way the people can really know who God is, because it's been passed down from generation to generation. And like anything that's passed down, each generation changes just a little. Maybe a little something's added. Maybe a little something's forgotten. So they don't have a real grasp of who God is, but they know that there is a God, and that's the reason they're crying out to him. In verse 10 of chapter 3 it says, "Now therefore, come down, I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign unto you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." Now the burning bush is right there at Mount Sinai. So God is basically saying to Moses, I'm bringing you back here, and you people can worship here.
It's ironic, though. God used one of man's greatest weaknesses, his curiosity. And Moses saw this bush, but though it burned, it was not consumed. And he kept looking at it, wondering what was going on with it. And it's fire, and he wanted to take a closer look. And then even though he didn't want the job, his curiosity overwhelmed him. I still want to get a closer look. I want to see I want to know what makes it burn. Why is it not consumed? Who's causing it? And in doing so, and then too, all this time they were in Egypt. Like I said, they had bowed down to the Egyptian gods. There was no teaching, no prophets then at that time, so they didn't really know.
They didn't know who God was. They knew who God was, but they didn't really know God. How about put it that way? They knew God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they didn't know a lot about him. So they are going to be introduced to who God is in a miraculous way, as we shall see as we press on. In verse 14, this is a very important verse, chapter 3. And God said to Moses, because Moses asked him, who am I going to say sent me? And he says, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent you. Remember back in one of our earlier classes, we talked about Jehovah and what it meant versus El Shaddai or El Onan. Remember we talked about that? So God is introducing himself as a covenant God. I am who I am is a Jehovah. I am Jehovah. I am a covenant God. My covenant is with you, the Jewish people. So he is introducing himself here as a covenant God. Now, the Israelites knew God in the past and the things that he had done with their forefathers. And of course, they knew that they've always been promised that they would be back to Canaan, because that's been passed down from generation to generation. So they knew there was a God in the future, but they never understood a God of the present. And this is where they're going to be introduced to God of the present. God has been known from a distance, and he had not been revealed. As you said, there's been no prophets. There's been nobody to say who God is. So this is a very important time. Jeremiah says in 600 BC, I will teach them and they will know that my name is Lord. And Lord, you remember we talked about the fact that Lord means Jehovah, covenant God. So all through the Bible, and you'll start seeing and noticing that God is referenced to as Lord with a capital L. And this is important because they're going to begin to know who God is and what it means to know God. Now the stage of the Exodus has been set. as we talked about, Moses argued with him. God said, I'll take care of you. I'll even send your brother Aaron, because Moses said, hey, I can't speak. I'm not a very good person at talking. But when you look over in Acts chapter 7, it shows that he is eloquent in speech. So Moses is he's just trying to worm around. Was that the second bell? All right, we'll pick up right there. Y'all, thank you for the bell reminding me, because I can't hear it. All right, thank you.